Before this story unfolds, take a moment to comment where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear challenges assumptions people carry about power, dignity, and silence. The story begins on an ordinary evening that would later redefine several lives forever. Daniel Whitmore, a self-made American millionaire known for discipline and control, believed order was the foundation of success. His mansion ran on schedules, boundaries, and unspoken rules. Among the people who kept that world functioning was Maria Santos, a Filipino woman who worked quietly, never late, never visible unless necessary. That night, Daniel walked into the kitchen earlier than usual, distracted by a delayed conference call and an unsettled mind. What he saw stopped him cold. Maria stood near the counter, carefully eating food scraped from untouched plates meant for disposal. It was not hunger that shocked him first, but the precision in her movements, as if she had rehearsed this moment many times. Daniel felt anger, confusion, and something deeper he could not name. He did not speak immediately. He watched, absorbing the contradiction between wealth and restraint unfolding before him silently. Daniel's first instinct was authority, the reflex of a man accustomed to control. He cleared his throat, and Maria froze instantly, eyes lowered, shoulders tight, already prepared for consequences she assumed were inevitable. In that silence, years of unspoken hierarchy pressed heavily between them. Daniel asked one question, sharp and restrained, demanding to know why she was eating leftovers meant to be thrown away. Maria answered without excuses, explaining that wasting food felt wrong to her, that in her childhood nothing edible was ever discarded. She spoke calmly, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying fear she refused to voice. Daniel dismissed her with a short nod and left the kitchen, but sleep did not come that night. The image followed him relentlessly, forcing him to confront something he had long avoided, the invisible distance between generosity and dignity. He reviewed her employment records, her wages, her performance. Everything was exemplary. Yet something was fundamentally broken. By morning, Daniel had made a decision that would ripple far beyond a simple workplace correction. He was no longer reacting as an employer, but as a man confronting the cost of his own detachment. The next day, Daniel called Maria into his office, a space that usually meant reprimands or instructions delivered without discussion. Maria entered prepared for dismissal. Instead, Daniel asked her about her life before arriving in America. At first, she offered minimal answers, conditioned to keep personal history separate from employment. But Daniel persisted, not with pressure, but patience. Slowly, Maria spoke about growing up in a coastal province, about siblings sharing one meal, about her mother teaching her that food carried memory and respect. She explained that sending money home meant sacrificing comfort, sometimes dignity. Daniel listened without interruption, something few people ever experienced from him. The conversation unsettled him deeply. He realized he had built a world where efficiency mattered more than understanding, where people existed as functions rather than lives. When Maria finished, Daniel apologized, not for catching her, but for never asking who she was. That apology shifted something irreversible. Maria did not cry. She simply nodded, absorbing the unfamiliar weight of being heard. Daniel's response did not end with words. Within days, changes quietly took place. Maria's salary was adjusted upward without announcement. Her working hours were restructured to allow rest and personal time. But the most shocking decision came when Daniel instructed the household staff that no edible food would ever be discarded again. Meals would be shared, donated, or preserved. This was not charity, he insisted, but respect. Maria noticed the shift immediately, though she said nothing. Yet what Daniel did next extended far beyond his household. He began researching the lives of migrant domestic workers across the country, uncovering patterns of silence, underpayment, and normalized sacrifice. The realization disturbed him more than any business loss ever had. He saw how wealth insulated him from consequences that others carried daily. Maria, unknowingly, had become the catalyst for a reckoning Daniel could no longer ignore. He was not trying to fix guilt. He was trying to correct blindness. And once that blindness lifted, there was no returning to ignorance. Weeks later, Daniel invited Maria to a dinner she did not prepare. The table included representatives from worker advocacy groups, financial advisors, and legal consultants. Maria was confused, uncertain why she was present. Daniel explained that he was launching a foundation focused on fair labor treatment for migrant workers, beginning with domestic employees. Maria's story, shared anonymously, had shaped its framework. She resisted at first, uncomfortable being associated with change that felt too large. Daniel clarified that her participation was optional, but her insight was invaluable. For the first time since arriving in America, Maria felt her experiences were not something to hide, but something that mattered. She agreed, cautiously. That night marked a shift not just in her life, but in Daniel's identity. He was no longer merely a wealthy employer reacting to an uncomfortable moment. He had become accountable to a truth he could not unlearn. And accountability demanded action, not gestures. As the foundation took shape, backlash followed. Daniel faced criticism from peers who accused him of overcompensating or seeking public validation. He refused interviews and declined press attention, keeping Maria's identity protected. This silence confused observers, but it was intentional. Daniel understood that real change did not require applause. Meanwhile, Maria began training as a consultant, learning labor law, communication skills, and financial literacy. The process was intimidating, but empowering. She struggled with imposter syndrome, questioning whether her voice truly belonged in these spaces. Daniel never positioned himself as her savior. Instead, he removed obstacles and stepped aside. That distinction mattered deeply. Maria slowly recognized that her worth was not defined by gratitude, but by contribution. The power dynamic that once silenced her had begun to dissolve, replaced by something unfamiliar yet steady: respect. Months passed, and the foundation's impact grew quietly. Policy recommendations reached lawmakers. Employers attended mandatory workshops. Migrant workers received legal protections previously unavailable. Maria, once invisible, now helped shape systems that prevented others from living in silence. She never forgot the night she was caught eating leftovers. That moment remained painful, but it no longer defined her as ashamed. Instead, it marked the beginning of transformation. Daniel often reflected on how close he came to reacting with punishment rather than curiosity. He recognized how easily power could destroy dignity without intention. The experience reshaped his leadership style across all areas of his life. Employees noticed changes. Meetings became conversations. Decisions carried human consequences. The mansion still stood, but its atmosphere had changed. It no longer functioned as a symbol of separation, but responsibility. Years later, Daniel would describe that night as the most expensive lesson he ever learned, not in money, but in awareness. Maria eventually returned to the Philippines, not in retreat, but with purpose. She opened a community center offering education and employment resources for women preparing to work abroad. Her journey had come full circle, rooted in dignity rather than survival. Daniel continued funding the foundation but remained deliberately distant from its spotlight. He understood that impact did not require ownership. What shocked everyone was not the money he spent, but the humility he embraced. One moment of restraint, one decision to listen rather than dominate, altered countless lives. The story spread quietly, carried not by headlines, but by changed systems and restored self-worth. And it all began with leftovers that were never meant to be eaten, yet nourished something far greater than hunger. Maria's return to the Philippines was not celebrated with ceremonies or speeches, but with quiet resolve. She arrived carrying knowledge rather than savings, understanding rather than fear. The community center she founded started small, offering guidance sessions to women considering overseas work. She spoke honestly about contracts, rights, and the emotional toll of silence. Her credibility came not from titles, but lived experience. Women listened because she never exaggerated hope or disguised hardship. Slowly, the center became a trusted place where preparation replaced desperation. Meanwhile, Daniel remained thousands of miles away, monitoring progress only when asked. He had learned that influence could exist without interference. The foundation expanded into multiple countries, partnering with local advocates instead of imposing foreign solutions. Each success reinforced Daniel's belief that leadership was not about visibility, but alignment with values. Maria occasionally sent updates, never asking for praise or favors. Their relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee into something more precise, mutual respect without dependency. What began as a moment of discomfort had transformed into a network of change neither could have planned. And yet, both understood that this transformation demanded constant vigilance to endure. Not everyone welcomed the changes Maria encouraged. Recruitment agencies resisted transparency, fearing loss of control. Some employers dismissed her guidance as unnecessary caution. Maria faced criticism quietly, refusing confrontation unless it served education. She learned that progress often provoked resistance before acceptance. Back in America, Daniel encountered similar pushback within elite circles. Friends questioned why he involved himself in labor reform when profits were unaffected. Daniel answered rarely, understanding that explanation invited debate, not understanding. Instead, he allowed outcomes to speak. Legal reforms influenced by the foundation reduced exploitation cases. Worker satisfaction improved retention rates. Even skeptics began to notice benefits once dismissed as idealistic. Maria's center gained regional recognition, attracting volunteers and educators who expanded its reach. Despite this, Maria remained grounded, aware of how easily recognition could distort purpose. She reminded herself daily why she began. Dignity should never require permission. Daniel, reflecting privately, acknowledged how close he once was to reinforcing harm through indifference. That realization never left him. It guided every decision, reminding him that morality was not inherited with wealth, but chosen through awareness. And awareness required humility, continuously practiced. Years into the foundation's work, Maria received an invitation to advise an international labor conference. She hesitated, questioning whether her voice belonged among policymakers and executives. Eventually, she accepted, not for status, but representation. Her message was simple and direct. Protection must be proactive, not reactive. Prevention mattered more than punishment. Her words resonated because they avoided blame and focused on systems. Daniel followed the conference remotely, proud but distant, resisting any temptation to intervene. He understood that Maria's authority no longer came from association with him. It stood independently. After the conference, requests flooded in for similar centers across Southeast Asia. Maria declined rapid expansion, insisting sustainability mattered more than scale. She had learned that rushing solutions often replicated the same inequalities they aimed to fix. Daniel supported this restraint, funding infrastructure rather than headlines. Together, without constant communication, they practiced a rare form of partnership rooted in trust rather than control. Their story was never about rescue. It was about recognition. And recognition, once awakened, demanded responsibility that neither could abandon. As time passed, Daniel's business philosophy evolved irreversibly. He revised hiring practices, prioritized ethical supply chains, and demanded transparency from partners. These decisions occasionally reduced short-term profits, but strengthened long-term resilience. Investors questioned him. Daniel welcomed scrutiny, believing that values tested under pressure proved their authenticity. Employees noticed the difference, describing a culture where accountability replaced fear. Meanwhile, Maria encountered challenges of a different nature. Some families resisted her teachings, clinging to beliefs that suffering was necessary for opportunity. Maria addressed this carefully, respecting cultural realities while advocating self-worth. She understood that change could not be imposed without empathy. Her patience paid off. Slowly, conversations shifted. Women began negotiating contracts. Families asked informed questions. Expectations adjusted. Daniel and Maria rarely spoke now, yet their paths remained aligned. They did not need constant affirmation. Each understood the origin of their journey. It was not born from strategy or generosity, but from a moment of confrontation that forced reflection. That moment remained the foundation beneath everything they built, reminding them that awareness must precede action to be meaningful. One evening, Daniel reviewed a report detailing how many workers had avoided exploitation due to early education programs. The numbers were significant, but what struck him were the personal testimonies attached. Stories of confidence, negotiation, and self-respect replaced narratives of survival. Daniel realized that wealth, when guided by intention, could dismantle the very structures it once benefited from. This realization humbled him. Across the ocean, Maria faced a different reflection. A young woman approached her, sharing gratitude for advice that prevented a dangerous contract. Maria listened silently, recognizing herself in the woman's fear and hope. These moments reinforced her belief that dignity multiplied when shared. She did not romanticize hardship. She focused on preparation. Daniel later sent a brief message, acknowledging progress without praise. Maria replied with equal restraint. Their communication reflected mutual understanding rather than obligation. The story that once shocked outsiders had matured into something quieter, more durable. Not transformation through spectacle, but through systems. And systems, once corrected, outlived individuals. That permanence mattered more than recognition ever could. As public interest gradually faded, the work continued steadily. Daniel welcomed the quiet, believing sustained impact thrived away from attention. He redirected resources toward training programs that empowered workers to advocate independently. Control was deliberately decentralized. Maria adopted similar principles, encouraging local leadership within her centers. She stepped back when necessary, allowing others to lead. This restraint was difficult, but essential. Both understood that permanence required distribution of responsibility. Occasionally, Daniel reflected on how easily the original moment could have ended differently. A raised voice. A dismissal. Silence reinforced by power. That alternate outcome haunted him. It reminded him how fragile turning points truly were. Maria, too, revisited that memory, not with bitterness, but clarity. It had exposed imbalance, but also possibility. Neither romanticized the past. They used it as reference, not identity. Their lives moved forward shaped, not defined, by that encounter. What shocked everyone was not a single decision, but the discipline to continue choosing awareness long after attention disappeared. That discipline became their shared legacy, though neither claimed ownership over it. Years later, Daniel quietly transferred leadership of the foundation to an independent board composed primarily of former migrant workers. This decision surprised many, but felt inevitable to him. Authority, he believed, belonged with those most affected. Maria supported the transition, advising briefly before stepping aside entirely. Her focus returned to education and mentorship. She had learned when to lead and when to withdraw. Daniel retired from active business life soon after, dedicating time to study ethics and labor history. He wanted to understand structures he once ignored. Maria continued working tirelessly, but with balance. She valued rest now, recognizing that burnout mirrored exploitation in subtler forms. Their paths diverged naturally, without ceremony. Yet their influence remained visible in policies, practices, and lives reshaped by dignity. The story that began with leftovers ended with legacy. Not a legacy of wealth redistributed, but of perspective corrected. And that correction, once made, proved impossible to reverse. It continued quietly, through conversations, contracts, and confidence passed forward. The shock was never the act itself, but the consistency that followed long after the moment passed. The world rarely noticed when exploitation decreased gradually. Progress lacked drama. But within communities, the difference was unmistakable. Families reported safer outcomes. Workers returned home with savings and self-respect intact. Maria observed these changes with measured satisfaction, aware that vigilance remained necessary. Daniel, now distant from daily operations, still followed developments closely. He understood that systems could regress without attention. Both accepted that their work was incomplete by nature. Justice required maintenance. Occasionally, journalists resurfaced the story, framing it as redemption. Daniel rejected that narrative privately. Redemption implied guilt absolved. He believed responsibility endured. Maria shared this perspective, refusing to frame her experience as salvation. She insisted it was evolution through awareness. Their shared restraint preserved integrity. They never capitalized on the story's emotional appeal. Instead, they protected its substance. Over time, the original moment became less sensational and more instructional. It served as a case study in leadership, power, and listening. And though the world moved on, the principles endured quietly, embedded in systems that no longer required their presence to function. That permanence defined success more accurately than applause ever could. As the next generation entered the workforce, Maria noticed subtle shifts in expectations. Young women asked questions once considered inappropriate. Employers adapted contracts preemptively. Education had normalized dignity. Maria felt gratitude, not pride. She understood progress was collective. Daniel experienced similar reflections while mentoring young entrepreneurs. He emphasized ethical frameworks alongside profit models. Many listened. Some resisted. Daniel accepted both outcomes. Influence could not be forced. He had learned that lesson early. When asked about his greatest achievement, he rarely referenced numbers. Instead, he spoke of learning to pause before reacting. That pause had changed everything. Maria echoed this sentiment when advising new mentors. She taught listening as a skill, not instinct. The moment that once threatened her security had become a lesson she shared without shame. That transformation defined resilience. Neither sought monuments. They valued momentum. Their story, stripped of drama, stood as evidence that awareness could reshape systems when followed by sustained action. And that action, quietly repeated, created ripples that extended beyond visibility, embedding dignity into everyday decisions made by people who would never know their names. Eventually, Maria stepped away from daily operations, trusting those she trained. She returned to her hometown, reconnecting with family and community. Her life had come full circle, enriched rather than burdened by experience. Daniel, living quietly, reflected often on how wealth once insulated him from humanity. He no longer feared discomfort. He welcomed it as a signal for growth. Their occasional correspondence remained brief and purposeful. No nostalgia. No ablegación. Just acknowledgement of shared origin. The world had changed incrementally, not because of a single act, but because that act was followed by commitment. Maria never forgot the feeling of being seen, truly seen, without judgment. Daniel never forgot the cost of seeing too late. Their memories served as anchors, not weights. The shock that once captivated attention matured into understanding. And understanding, once integrated, demanded responsibility. That responsibility continued to manifest in decisions made by others influenced indirectly by their work. The story ended not with closure, but continuity. Because dignity, once introduced into a system, refused to disappear quietly. It insisted on being protected, reinforced, and passed forward deliberately. Looking back, observers often searched for a defining gesture, a single dramatic moment that explained everything. They misunderstood the nature of change. It was not the discovery of leftovers that mattered most, but the refusal to ignore what they represented. Maria's courage was not in being caught, but in speaking truth without apology. Daniel's growth was not in generosity, but in restraint. These subtleties escaped sensational framing, yet shaped outcomes profoundly. Over time, their story became less about individuals and more about choices available to anyone holding power. The lesson was uncomfortable. Harm often persisted not through cruelty, but convenience. Awareness disrupted convenience. That disruption required humility. Maria and Daniel embodied this principle differently, yet harmoniously. Their influence persisted not because they remained visible, but because systems absorbed their values. And values, once institutionalized, guided behavior independently. That independence signaled success. The story, stripped of emotion, revealed its core. Dignity flourished when curiosity replaced judgment. That truth transcended circumstance, culture, and status. It waited patiently for those willing to pause, listen, and act responsibly. The legacy of that night could not be measured in donations or policies alone. It lived in altered instincts, in questions asked before assumptions formed. Maria's life reflected quiet strength cultivated through respect. Daniel's reflected humility earned through awareness. Neither sought recognition for what followed. They understood that impact matured beyond ownership. The story endured because it resisted simplification. It refused to present heroes or villains, only choices and consequences. What shocked everyone initially was an action. What mattered ultimately was consistency. A single moment had opened a door, but discipline kept it open. That discipline continued long after attention faded. Their journey demonstrated that dignity, once acknowledged, demanded structural protection. And protection required commitment, not emotion. The leftovers that once symbolized inequality had nourished a transformation that reached far beyond one household. It reminded those who heard it that power carried responsibility, and silence carried weight. The story ended not with resolution, but with invitation. An invitation to pause before reacting, to listen before judging, and to recognize that sometimes the smallest moments expose the greatest truths, waiting to be addressed with courage and restraint.